In January 1945, as the guns of the Second World War thundered across Eastern Europe, a Swedish diplomat in Budapest faced the most dangerous meeting of his life. For months, he had stared down Nazi officers, fascist militias, and death squads to save tens of thousands of Jews from deportation and execution. Now, as the Soviet Red Army closed its grip around the Hungarian capital, he prepared to walk into the headquarters of a new power. His name was Raoul Wallenberg. He had become a legend of courage in the face of Nazi terror, and in a few days he would vanish into the shadows of the Soviet prison system, swallowed by the machinery of a regime that would soon find itself staring in disbelief at the technological and moral power of the free world led by the United States. Raoul Wallenberg was born in 1912 into one of Sweden's most prominent families. The Wallenbergs were bankers, industrialists, and power brokers, the kind of people who moved money and influence quietly in the background. From the beginning, Raoul's life followed a different pattern. He was intelligent, restless, and curious about the wider world. After finishing school, he traveled, studied, and absorbed languages. Eventually, he crossed the Atlantic and enrolled at the University of Michigan in the United States. At Michigan, he studied architecture, but he learned much more than building design. He saw American society up close in the 1930s, its energy, its openness, its mix of cultures, and its belief in individual initiative. He rode American trains, walked American streets, and watched American factories at work. For a young European in an era of rising dictatorships, it was a powerful contrast. In Europe, dictators were building monuments and secret police networks. In America, ordinary people were building cars, bridges, and skyscrapers. Even then, Raoul understood that technology and freedom were deeply connected. After graduating in 1935, he returned to Europe and entered the world of banking and commerce. Through a trading firm, he worked closely with a Hungarian Jewish businessman, Koloman Lauer. Together, they managed import and export operations between Sweden and Central Europe. This partnership did more than give Raoul a career. It gave him intimate knowledge of Hungary, its language, its politics, and its people. It also gave him a front-row view of what was happening to Jews in Nazi-dominated Europe. By the early 1940s, his reports back to Sweden made clear that something catastrophic was unfolding. In 1944, that catastrophe reached its peak in Hungary. On March 19, 1944, German troops occupied the country, turning a shaky ally into a controlled satellite. Adolf Eichmann arrived with a special SS unit to carry out what he called the final solution for Hungarian Jews. In a matter of weeks, ghettos were created in the countryside, Jews were rounded up, and trains began rolling to Auschwitz. Between May and July 1944, around 437,000 Jews from the Hungarian provinces were deported to the gas chambers. In Budapest, however, things were different. The capital still held some 200,000 Jews, initially spared from mass deportation. Under intense pressure from Allied leaders, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, the King of Sweden, and the Pope, Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy halted deportations in July 1944. For a brief and fragile moment, there was a window of opportunity. The Nazis had not yet finished their work. The Jews of Budapest were in mortal danger, but not yet lost. That was the moment when Washington and Stockholm decided to act. In the United States, President Roosevelt had created the War Refugee Board, a special agency tasked with trying to rescue Jews and other victims from Nazi control. The board's representative in Stockholm, Ivar Olsen, needed someone bold, resourceful, and unbound by traditional diplomacy to lead a mission in Budapest. Raoul Wallenberg's name came up. He knew Hungary. He spoke several languages. He was young, energetic, and backed by a powerful family. Most importantly, he was willing to take risks. After negotiations with the Swedish government, Raoul was given a post as first secretary at the Swedish legation in Budapest. Officially, he was a diplomat. In reality, he was the spearhead of an American-backed rescue operation in the heart of Nazi territory. Raoul arrived in Budapest on July 9, 1944. The city was tense, controlled by German forces and Hungarian collaborators, scarred by war and filled with refugees. Within days, he began turning his small diplomatic office into a rescue headquarters. He recruited aggressively Hungarian Jews, Christian sympathizers, anyone competent and willing to work. He told his employees to remove their yellow stars. From now on, he said, they were under Swedish protection. Wallenberg's genius lay in understanding how to weaponize bureaucracy and symbols. He realized that even in the chaos of late-war Hungary, official stamps, signatures, and flags still had power. The German authorities and their Hungarian allies in the Aerocross movement were obsessed with documents. Papers could decide life or death. Raoul decided to flood the system with papers of his own. He designed what became famous as the Schutzpass, the Swedish protective passport. Existing protective documents were dry and unimpressive. Raoul redesigned them to look as official and intimidating as possible. The Swedish coat of arms, bold colors, ornate typography, and legal language stating that the bearer was under Swedish protection and awaiting repatriation. He printed thousands of these passes, often beyond the original quotas authorized by Stockholm. Each one could mean an individual, or sometimes a whole family, pulled back from the brink. With his team, he distributed these documents to Jews across Budapest. Some were handed out in the office, others were smuggled into holding centers, still others were thrust into the hands of people already being pushed towards trains. The Schutzpass did not have magical legal power, but in the fog of war, its appearance and the fear of future accountability persuaded many German and Hungarian officials to respect it. At the same time, Wallenberg began creating safe houses. He rented and bought buildings around the city and declared them annexes of the Swedish legation, a kind of extended diplomatic territory. On their walls, he hung large Swedish flags and plaques identifying them as Swedish properties. Inside, he crammed in as many people as possible, families sleeping in stairwells, hallways, and basements. Kitchens turned into soup lines, makeshift clinics treated the sick. Each building became a fragile island of safety in an ocean of persecution. He was not alone. Other neutral countries, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, the Vatican, also established protected houses and issued documents. Together, these efforts formed what became known as the International Ghetto. But Raoul was the most aggressive, the most daring, and the most visible of these rescuers. He used cars, drivers, and couriers to maintain contact between the safe houses, to distribute food and medicines, and to monitor the ever-changing moves of the Nazi and Aerocross authorities.
The stories of his direct interventions are some of the most dramatic in the entire history of the Holocaust. Witnesses recall him racing to train stations when word arrived that Jews with Swedish papers had been loaded onto deportation trains. He would arrive with a stack of Schutzpasse, march up to the train, climb onto the cars, and shout out names. When he found people who could plausibly be claimed as Swedish protégés, he insisted they be removed from the train. Sometimes he did not even wait for names. He would thrust documents into the hands of desperate people pressed against the barred windows, then turn to the German or Hungarian officers and declare that these individuals were now under Swedish protection. Backed by his diplomatic status and his powerful gaze, he argued, negotiated, and sometimes simply bullied the guards into releasing them. On other occasions, as forced marches carried Jewish prisoners on foot toward the Austrian border, Raoul used his cars to intercept the columns. Driving alongside lines of exhausted, starving people, he and his colleagues handed out protective papers and pulled people out of formation. He then loaded them into Swedish-marked vehicles and drove them back to Budapest, back into safe houses. In freezing weather, under hostile eyes, he used every tool at his disposal: stamps of wax and ink, the blue and yellow of his flag, the fear of future trials, to push back against annihilation. By late 1944, the situation in Hungary took an even darker turn. In October, Regent Miklos Horthy was overthrown in a coup that brought the Arrow Cross Party, led by Ferenc Szalasi, fully to power. These Hungarian fascists were even more fanatical than many Germans. They launched a campaign of terror in Budapest. Arrow Cross squads broke into homes, dragged Jews into the streets, and murdered them on the banks of the Danube, shooting them and letting the river carry away their bodies. Wallenberg did not retreat. He reinforced his safe houses and kept issuing papers. He visited prisons and holding centers, demanding the release of anyone with Swedish documents. He bribed officials when necessary, using money from the War Refugee Board and donations from Jewish organizations. He confronted Arrow Cross leaders face to face, leaning on his status as a representative of a neutral power and hinting at what would happen when the war ended and their names were known in the West. In January 1944, as Soviet forces closed in on Budapest, a new horror loomed. Plans were drawn up to exterminate the remaining Jews in the main Budapest ghetto. Tens of thousands of people crowded into a tiny area. German and Arrow Cross forces considered blowing up the ghetto or launching mass shootings before the Red Army could arrive. If carried out, this would have been a final, gigantic massacre. When Wallenberg learned of this, he moved quickly. He sought a meeting with the German commander in Budapest, General Gerhard Schmidhuber. According to multiple accounts, Raoul confronted Schmidhuber directly. He told him that if the ghetto was destroyed, he would personally ensure that Schmidhuber was held responsible as a war criminal. He would document his actions, send reports to the Allies, and see that his name stood at the top of the list of those to be hanged after the war. Schmidhuber, reading the direction of the conflict and fearing the future more than his superiors, backed down. The order to annihilate the ghetto was not executed. When Soviet forces finally entered that part of Budapest, around 70,000 Jews were still alive there. Raoul's audacity, backed by the promise of Allied justice, had helped prevent one of the last great massacres of the Holocaust. By the time the battle for Budapest ended, Raoul Wallenberg and his team had saved at least tens of thousands of people through protective passports, safe houses, interventions at trains and marches, and relentless pressure. Precise numbers vary. Some estimates suggest around 20,000 individuals directly protected by Swedish documents. Others go higher when including families and those in the international ghetto. What all historians agree on is that without his mission, the Jewish population of Budapest would have suffered on a far greater scale.
You might expect that when the Red Army arrived, a force that would soon be hailed as liberators of Auschwitz itself, Raoul Wallenberg would be celebrated as an ally. After all, he had fought Nazis in the streets, shielded civilians, and risked his life repeatedly. But the Soviet system was built on suspicion, secrecy, and absolute control. To the Soviet security services, a man who moved freely in wartime Budapest, handled money from an American agency, and ran a large private network looked less like a hero and more like a potential spy. On January 13, 1945, Soviet troops reached the area where Raoul was operating and made contact with him. 4 days later, on January 17th, he left Budapest in a Soviet vehicle, heading east toward the city of Debrecen, where the Soviet command had its headquarters. Those around him understood that he wanted to coordinate humanitarian aid for the survivors, to secure food, shelter, and medical assistance. His reported last words, spoken to a colleague, were chillingly clear. "I am going to meet the Russian commander. I do not know whether I am going as a guest or as a prisoner." He never returned. For more than a decade, the Soviet Union claimed to know nothing about his fate. Raoul Wallenberg had joined a new category of victims, prisoners of the Soviet security apparatus, hidden in cells, files, and silence.
Later evidence from Russian archives revealed that he was indeed arrested by Smersh, the Soviet military counterintelligence service, and transported to Moscow. He was registered in the infamous Lubyanka prison, headquarters of the NKVD, and later held in Lefortovo prison. He was interrogated as a suspected foreign agent. Then, like so many others, he vanished into the maze. For years, the Soviets stonewalled Swedish inquiries. Only in 1957 did they produce a document known as the Gromyko Memorandum, claiming that Wallenberg had died of a heart attack in Lubyanka prison on July 17, 1947. No body was returned, no complete medical record was provided. The explanation was vague and conveniently uncheckable. Over the decades, other pieces of evidence emerged. Former prisoners recalled hearing about a Swedish inmate, or prisoner number 7, who may have been Wallenberg. Some records from the late 1940s suggest that a highly classified prisoner, matching his profile, was interrogated after the date of his supposed death. Soviet and later Russian authorities have never provided full access to all relevant files. The most likely conclusion is that he was executed or died under interrogation, his body buried anonymously, his memory deliberately buried with him. What does it say about a regime that takes a man who saved tens of thousands from Nazi death squads and locks him away as a suspected enemy? It says that, to that regime, independent action, especially action coordinated with Western agencies, was intolerable. In the Stalinist worldview, loyalty was vertical, running from the people to the party and the secret police. A man who used his own initiative, who answered to his own conscience and to foreign partners, was a threat, no matter how many lives he saved. In this sense, Wallenberg's fate is a small but telling piece of a much larger story. While the United States and its allies were building an international order based on open cooperation, technological innovation, and increasing transparency, the Soviet Union was building an order based on secrecy, fear, and controlled information. The same state that would soon shock the world with Sputnik and nuclear tests was unable to tolerate a single Swedish diplomat whose heroism did not fit its narrative. As the Cold War unfolded, the contrast between these two worlds grew sharper. In the West, wartime experiences like Wallenberg's became subjects of books, films, and public debate. In the United States, survivors he had rescued could testify freely about what he had done. His story spread through newspapers, documentaries, and eventually television and digital media. In the Soviet bloc, his name was a taboo, an uncomfortable question mark attached to a file in a secret archive. At the same time, the balance of technological power was shifting. The Soviet Union achieved spectacular feats, launching the first satellite, sending the first human into space, and building terrifying arsenals of missiles and tanks. But these were built in a system that jailed and executed people like Wallenberg. The United States responded with its own breakthroughs: moon landings, integrated circuits, computer networks, produced in a society where scientists, entrepreneurs, and journalists could question, criticize, and innovate without fear of midnight knocks on the door. For the men who ran the Soviet state, this was deeply unsettling. They knew that their system could force people to work, but they also knew that it could not easily produce the kind of open, flexible, innovative culture that made American technology so dynamic. They relied on espionage, copying Western designs, and harnessing brilliant individuals under constant surveillance. The same mindset that saw Wallenberg as a suspicious asset of the West prevented them from fully embracing the openness that drives technical revolutions. In the West, Wallenberg's legacy continued to grow. In 1963, Israel honored him as one of the righteous among the nations, a title reserved for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. In later decades, he was granted honorary citizenship by the United States, Canada, Israel, and Australia.
Monuments and streets bearing his name appeared in Stockholm, Budapest, Washington, Jerusalem, and many other cities. In the United States, Congress placed a bust of Raoul Wallenberg in the Capitol, recognizing him as a hero of humanity and a symbol of resistance against both Nazism and communist oppression. United States universities established lectures and programs in his name, encouraging students to think about moral courage, human rights, and the responsibilities that come with freedom. In Russia, the story remained unresolved. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Swedish and Russian historians worked together on joint commissions to examine the archives. They confirmed that he was a prisoner in Moscow and that the Soviet government had lied for years about knowing nothing, but they did not produce a definitive account of his final hours or the location of his remains. The file was still incomplete, the ending still murky. This unresolved mystery is more than a historical footnote. It represents the lingering shadow of a system that treated human beings as expendable pieces on a political chessboard. For Americans, the contrast is stark. In a free society, a man like Wallenberg could have been debriefed, honored, and integrated into a network of post-war reconstruction and human rights advocacy. In the Soviet system, he was simply too independent, too connected to Western power, too inconvenient to survive. Today, when we look back at Raoul Wallenberg's story from an American perspective, several layers emerge. First, there is the admiration for his personal courage, the way he used his diplomatic status and creativity to outmaneuver Nazi and fascist killers. Second, there is the sobering anger at his disappearance, a hero of the Holocaust dragged into a Soviet cell and never seen again. Third, there is a deeper understanding of the Cold War itself, not just a contest of armies and weapons, but a contest between societies that could nurture and celebrate people like Wallenberg and societies that felt compelled to hide them. In the United States, a young student can open a laptop, type Raoul Wallenberg into a search bar, and instantly access archives, testimonies, documentaries, and academic studies. They can see his face, read survivors' accounts, and analyze declassified government files. All of this is powered by technologies, computers, the internet, and digital libraries that grew out of an open marketplace of ideas and innovation. The fact that his story is now globally known, rather than buried forever, is part of the legacy of the same technological civilization that the Soviet leadership both feared and envied.
Raoul Wallenberg's fate inside the Soviet system is a reminder of what happens when a state is more afraid of truth than of injustice. His recognition in the United States and other free countries is a reminder of what happens when technology, freedom, and moral memory work together. On one side, a man disappears into a file labeled Top Secret, his body unmarked, his name suppressed. On the other, that same man becomes a permanent presence, etched in stone, carved in bronze, written in code and stored on servers, taught in classrooms, discussed in videos like this one. In the end, the Soviet system that arrested Wallenberg is gone. The camps, the interrogators, the offices that signed his orders have passed into history. The United States, the War Refugee Board, and the web of institutions that carried his story forward survived and evolved into the global network we live in today. The regime that tried to silence him failed. The societies that chose to remember him succeeded. When you think about Raoul Wallenberg, think about a man standing on a train platform in 1944, waving a piece of paper and pulling a stranger out of a cattle car. Think about him walking into a Soviet headquarters in 1945, not knowing if he was a guest or a prisoner. Then think about the world we live in now, where stories like his travel at the speed of light, where the crimes of totalitarian regimes can be exposed and studied, and where the courage of one individual can inspire millions. That is the power of a free, technologically advanced society. That is the power that regimes like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union never fully understood and never fully controlled. And that is why, long after his captors have been forgotten, the name Raoul Wallenberg still stands in American memory and in the memory of the free world as a quiet yet overwhelming answer to tyranny.